What's up, history buffs? Today we're diving into the question that'll make you question everything. Romans did what? 10 tricks that still work today. And I'm not talking about boring stuff like they built roads. I'm talking about psychological warfare, manipulation tactics, and social engineering tricks so advanced that Silicon Valley executives are probably taking notes right now. Here's the thing that'll blow your mind. You think modern life is complicated? You think dealing with social media drama, office politics, and trying to get people to do what you want is hard? The Romans were playing 4D chess while the rest of the world was still figuring out checkers. These guys invented techniques for controlling crowds, managing public opinion, and getting what they want that are so effective. They're literally still being used today by politicians, marketers, and that one friend who always gets everyone to split the check their way. Real talk. This next part is going to sound absolutely bonkers, but stick with me. The Romans didn't just conquer the world through military might, they conquered it through pure psychological genius. They figured out how human nature works, and then weaponized it so effectively that we're still falling for the same tricks 2,000 years later. Let me paint you a picture. You're scrolling through your phone right now, getting bombarded with ads, notifications, and content designed to grab your attention and manipulate your behavior. Congratulations, you're experiencing Roman-level social engineering, just with better graphics. The techniques are identical. The psychology is the same. The only difference is the delivery method. Before we dive deeper into this rabbit hole, smash that like button if you want the raw, unfiltered truth about how the Romans basically invented modern manipulation, and let me know in the comments. Do you think you'd survive in ancient Rome? Or would you get completely played by these masters of human psychology? Because here's what they don't teach you in school. The Romans weren't just soldiers and senators. They were the world's first data scientists, social media influencers, and behavioral economists all rolled into one. They studied human behavior like it was a science, documented what worked, and then scaled those techniques across an entire empire. Take crowd control, for example. You know how modern police use specific formations and tactics to manage protests and large gatherings? The Romans invented that. You know how politicians use specific speaking techniques to get crowds fired up and on their side? Romans perfected it. You know how companies use loyalty programs and rewards to keep you coming back? Guess who figured that out first? The craziest part? Most of these tricks are so subtle and effective that you probably don't even realize when they're being used on you. Right now, today, in 2025, you're surrounded by Roman psychological warfare techniques disguised as modern marketing, politics, and social interaction. But here's where things get really wild. I'm about to show you exactly how these tricks work, why they're still so effective, and how you can spot them in your daily life. Some of these are going to make you paranoid about every interaction you have. Others are going to make you respect just how brilliant these ancient Romans really were. Hold up. Before we continue, drop a comment if you think modern people are smarter than ancient Romans, or if you think we're basically still the same creatures just with fancier technology. Because what I'm about to show you might completely change your perspective on human nature itself. The first trick we're diving into is so common, so everywhere, that you've probably experienced it at least 3 times just today. And once I explain how the Romans used it to control entire populations, you'll never look at modern advertising the same way again. All right, everyone, let's start with the big one. The trick that literally runs our entire modern economy, and you probably didn't even realize it. The Romans called it panem et circenses, bread and circuses. And if you think this is just about feeding people and entertaining them, you're missing the absolute genius of what they actually pulled off. Picture this. You're a Roman politician in 100 AD, and you've got a problem. You've got millions of people living in Rome. Most of them are poor, unemployed, and getting pretty pissed off about the whole rich people have everything while we have nothing situation. Sound familiar? Now you could actually fix their problems, create jobs, redistribute wealth, address the root causes, or you could do something way more clever and way more sinister. You give them free bread and free entertainment. Not because you're nice, because you're a psychological mastermind. Here's what the Romans figured out that blew my mind when I first learned about it. People will tolerate almost anything: corruption, inequality, terrible leadership, as long as their basic needs are met and they're sufficiently distracted. It's not about making people happy. It's about making them just comfortable enough that revolution seems like too much effort. The bread part is obvious. Keep people fed so they don't literally starve and riot. But the circuses? That's where it gets diabolical. The Romans didn't just throw some random entertainment at people. They engineered specific types of spectacles designed to release social tension and redirect anger. Gladiator fights weren't just entertainment. They were pressure release valves. All that rage about your crappy life conditions? Channel it into cheering for violence against people who are even more powerless than you. Chariot races weren't just sports. They created tribal identities that made people fight each other instead of fighting the system. You're not oppressed citizen number 47. You're a Blues fan or a Greens fan. And your real enemy is that jerk sitting next to you who supports the wrong team. But here's where things get really wild. This isn't ancient history, folks. This is your life right now. Netflix and chill, bread and circuses, social media outrage cycles that have you fighting with strangers online instead of organizing for actual change. Bread and circuses. Professional sports that get you emotionally invested in millionaires playing games while your actual community falls apart. Bread and circuses. Fast food that keeps you fed just enough to keep working but not healthy enough to think clearly. Bread and circuses. The formula is identical. Give people just enough to survive. Flood them with distractions that feel important but aren't. And watch them police each other instead of questioning why the system is set up this way. And the most insane part? We've scaled it up. The Romans had to physically gather people in one place for their circuses. We've got circuses beaming directly into our eyeballs 24/7 through screens that we voluntarily carry everywhere. Real talk. Pause the video right now and think about this. How much of your mental energy this week went to things that actually matter to your life versus how much went to consuming content, following drama, or getting worked up about stuff you can't control? The Romans would be absolutely blown away by how effectively we've implemented their system. We've got people voluntarily isolating themselves with personalized distractions while debating whether pineapple belongs on pizza instead of asking why housing costs 60% of their income. But here's the kicker. Once you see this pattern, you can't unsee it. Every time you find yourself getting sucked into some meaningless controversy or binge-watching shows while important stuff in your life stays broken, remember, you're experiencing a Roman social control technique that's over 2,000 years old. Listen up, because I'm about to tell you something that's going to sound absolutely insane. The next trick we're covering is even more subtle and even more effective. It's about how the Romans figured out how to make people compete against each other for scraps while thinking they were achieving something meaningful. And it's literally the foundation of modern social media. Buckle up, Buttercup, because this one's going to mess with your head. The Romans invented something called the cursus honorum, the course of honors, and it's basically the exact same psychological manipulation system that runs Instagram, TikTok, and LinkedIn. No joke. Here's how diabolically clever this was. The Romans created a ladder of meaningless titles and positions that people could climb, giving them the illusion of progress and achievement while keeping them completely distracted from real power. Sound familiar yet? Let me break this down for you. In Roman society, you had these official ranks you could achieve: quaestor, praetor, consul, each one supposedly more prestigious than the last. People would spend their entire lives grinding to move up one level, competing with each other, playing politics, doing whatever it took to get that next title. Meanwhile, the actual power, that stayed with the same small group of ultra-wealthy families who controlled everything behind the scenes. But here's the genius part. Everyone participating in this system felt important. They felt like they were achieving something. They felt like they were making progress. They'd put their titles on everything, name-drop their positions at parties, and look down on people who hadn't climbed as high as they had. Does this sound like anything in your life right now? Maybe something involving follower counts, verification check marks, LinkedIn endorsements, or TikTok creator funds. The Romans figured out that humans have this deep psychological need for status and recognition. So instead of fighting that need or trying to eliminate it, they weaponized it. They created fake hierarchies that felt real, artificial scarcity that felt meaningful, and arbitrary achievements that felt important. And here's where it gets really twisted. The system was designed to keep people busy competing with each other instead of questioning why the system existed in the first place. You're not going to organize a revolution against inequality when you're too busy trying to get promoted to the next level of the ladder. Fast forward to 2025, and we've perfected this system in ways the Romans could never imagine. Instagram gives you follower milestones to chase. LinkedIn gives you connection goals and endorsement counts. TikTok gives you view thresholds for monetization. Gaming companies give you achievement badges and leaderboards. Even your fitness app gives you streaks and levels to maintain. Every single one of these is a modern cursus honorum, a fake hierarchy designed to keep you grinding for meaningless achievements, while the people who actually control these platforms extract value from your attention and data. Plot twist incoming. The most insidious part isn't that these systems exist. It's that they make you complicit in maintaining them. Just like Romans would police each other's behavior to maintain their positions in the cursus honorum, we police each other's social media behavior. We shame people for buying followers. We call out engagement bait. We create elaborate unwritten rules about what counts as authentic success. We've become the enforcers of our own manipulation. But here's where things get really wild. The Romans also figured out how to use this system to identify and neutralize potential threats. Anyone ambitious enough to challenge the real power structure would get sucked into climbing the fake ladder instead. They'd waste their energy on prestigious titles that came with zero actual authority. Think about it. How many brilliant, potentially revolutionary people are currently burning themselves out, trying to become influencers, instead of actually changing the world? How many people who could be organizing for real systemic change are instead grinding for blue check marks and brand partnerships? The cursus honorum wasn't just about control, it was about recruitment. It identified the most ambitious people in society and gave them a socially acceptable way to channel that ambition into harmless competition. And this is where our story takes a hard left turn. Because the third Roman trick we're about to dive into shows how they use people's own success within these fake hierarchies against them. They figured out how to make high achievers into willing participants in their own exploitation. And it's the exact same technique that modern corporations use to get their best employees to work themselves to death while being grateful for the privilege. Hold up. Before we continue, drop a comment if you've ever found yourself caring way too much about some arbitrary online metric, or if you think you'd be immune to this kind of psychological manipulation. Because I'm about to show you how the Romans made even their smartest citizens into willing slaves, and how that same system is probably running your career right now. All right, folks, buckle up because this next Roman trick is so psychologically twisted that when I first learned about it, I had to put the book down and just stare at the wall for like 20 minutes. The Romans figured out how to make their most successful people into the most trapped people, and they did it by making them grateful for their own exploitation. They called it dignitas, dignity through service. But what it really was, the world's first corporate loyalty program designed to turn high achievers into golden slaves. Here's how it worked, and I want you to pay attention because this is your life. The Romans would identify their most talented, ambitious citizens, the ones who could potentially cause problems, and they'd shower them with honors, responsibilities, and social status. Not money, mind you, status. You'd get appointed to some prestigious position. Let's say you're managing grain distribution for the empire. Sounds important, right? You're feeding millions of people. You've got a fancy title, people respect you, you get invited to all the right parties, you feel essential, you feel valued, you feel like you've made it. But here's the catch that would make every modern HR department weep with joy. All of these prestigious positions came with massive personal financial costs. You had to fund public games out of your own pocket. You had to maintain a certain lifestyle. You had to throw expensive parties for other officials. The higher you climbed, the more it cost you to maintain your position. So you'd work harder to afford being successful, which would make you more successful, which would make it cost more to maintain that success, which would make you work even harder. It's a psychological trap so perfect that victims would defend the system that was bankrupting them. And the most diabolical part? If you tried to step back, you'd lose everything. Your status, your social circle, your identity. You weren't just losing a job, you were losing yourself. Real talk. Does any of this sound familiar? Maybe something involving salary sacrifices for equity, working 80-hour weeks for experience, or taking on massive responsibilities without corresponding compensation because it's good for your career? Modern corporations have perfected the Roman dignitas system in ways that would make ancient senators jealous. They give you a fancy title, Senior Vice President of Strategic Innovation, but no real authority. They load you up with responsibilities that make you feel important while keeping you too busy to realize you're being exploited. They create company cultures where working yourself to death is seen as dedication, where sacrificing your personal life is seen as commitment. And just like the Romans, they make you pay for the privilege. You buy the expensive clothes to look the part. You work unpaid overtime to prove your worth. You skip vacations because taking time off might hurt your trajectory. You compete with colleagues instead of organizing with them because you're all fighting for the next rung on a ladder that's designed to exhaust you. The golden handcuffs aren't just about money. They're about identity. You become so invested in your professional persona that walking away feels like losing yourself. I can't quit. I'm a director. I can't take that sabbatical. What would people think? I can't speak up about working conditions. I have a reputation to maintain. But here's where things get really wild. The Romans took this system and scaled it across their entire empire. Every province had local elites competing for Roman recognition, spending their own wealth to build Roman infrastructure, enforcing Roman law, all while thinking they were achieving greatness. Sound like anything? Maybe something involving influencer culture, where people spend thousands of dollars on content creation equipment and endless hours building someone else's platform while competing for scraps of ad revenue? Or gig economy workers who buy their own cars, pay for their own gas, and take on all the financial risk while companies extract value from their labor? Plot twist incoming. The Romans didn't just use this to control individuals. They used it to control entire social classes. The wealthy competed to serve Rome, the middle class competed to become wealthy, and everyone was too busy climbing to notice that the ladder was designed to keep them in place. And this is where our story takes a hard left turn into something that's going to make you paranoid about every opportunity that comes your way. Because the fourth Roman trick shows how they used people's natural desire to belong to something bigger than themselves and turned that beautiful human impulse into a weapon of mass manipulation. It's the psychological technique behind every cult, every MLM scheme, and every political movement that asks you to sacrifice your individual interests for the greater good. Pause the video right now and guess what happens next. How do you think the Romans convinced people to willingly give up their personal agency while feeling like they were part of something noble and important? Listen up, because what I'm about to tell you is going to make you question every time someone has ever asked you to do something for the greater good. The Romans figured out how to hijack people's moral instincts and turn them into a control mechanism so effective that victims would punish themselves for not complying hard enough. They called it virtues, civic virtue. The idea that true morality meant sacrificing your individual interests for Rome. Sounds noble, right? Here's the psychological warfare part that'll blow your mind. They made people compete to see who could sacrifice the most for the collective, while defining the collective as whatever served the interests of the ruling class. Picture this. You're a Roman citizen, and the message you're getting from every direction is that good people put Rome first. Good fathers sacrifice for Rome. Good mothers send their sons to die for Rome. Good citizens pay extra taxes for Rome. Good Romans work harder, complain less, and judge anyone who doesn't meet these standards as selfish and unpatriotic. But here's the kicker. Rome wasn't some abstract ideal. Rome was controlled by specific people with specific interests. When they said sacrifice for Rome, they meant sacrifice for us while we get rich. When they said civic duty, they meant do what we want without questioning it. When they said virtue, they meant shut up and comply. The genius of this system is that it made people police themselves and each other. You didn't need secret police when citizens were competing to prove their virtue by calling out anyone who seemed insufficiently dedicated to the cause. And here's where things get really twisted. This isn't ancient history. This is every manipulative workplace culture, political movement, and social cause that uses moral pressure to extract compliance. We're not just a company, we're a family. Translation: sacrifice your boundaries because questioning us makes you a bad family member. We're building something bigger than ourselves. Translation: work for less money because asking for fair compensation makes you selfish. True believers don't ask questions. Translation: thinking critically makes you disloyal. The Romans perfected the art of making exploitation feel like virtue. Modern organizations have taken this playbook and run with it in ways that would make Roman senators jealous. MLM schemes use this exact technique. They're not selling you products, they're offering you the chance to be part of a business family that's changing lives. When you fail to recruit your friends, you're not protecting relationships, you're lacking vision. When you question the math, you're not being rational, you're having limiting beliefs. Political movements across the spectrum use this. They're not asking you to blindly follow, they're asking you to be on the right side of history. When you ask for evidence or nuance, you're not being thoughtful, you're enabling the enemy. When you prioritize your own well-being, you're not being human, you're being privileged or selfish. Even social media activism uses this playbook. You're not just scrolling through posts, you're either raising awareness or staying silent in the face of injustice. You're not just sharing your opinion, you're either speaking truth to power or perpetuating harm. There's no neutral ground, no complexity, no room for personal boundaries. But here's where things get really wild. The Romans took this system and weaponized shame as the enforcement mechanism. They figured out that humans would rather harm themselves than face social rejection, so they created societies where questioning the system was socially unacceptable. Real talk. This next part is going to sound absolutely bonkers, but stick with me. The most effective version of this trick is when victims start believing that their suffering is proof of their virtue. The more you sacrifice, the more virtuous you are. The more it hurts, the more it matters. The more you give up, the more committed you are to the cause. Sound familiar? Maybe something involving hustle culture where exhaustion becomes a badge of honor, or workplace cultures where having a life outside work makes you not committed enough, or social movements where the people who burn themselves out the fastest are celebrated as the most dedicated. The Romans didn't just want compliance, they wanted grateful compliance. They wanted people to thank them for the opportunity to sacrifice. And they got it. And this is where our story takes a hard left turn into something that's going to make you paranoid about every group dynamic you've ever been part of. Because the fifth Roman trick shows how they used people's natural desire for belonging to create artificial scarcity of acceptance. They figured out how to make inclusion feel like a privilege that had to be constantly earned. And it's the psychological foundation behind every toxic community, every abusive relationship, and every organization that keeps you walking on eggshells while desperately trying to prove you belong. If you're still with me, you're about to witness the most insane plot twist in psychological manipulation. How the Romans turned the human need for connection into a weapon that made people grateful for rejection. Buckle up, because this Roman trick is so psychologically devastating that when modern psychologists first studied it, they couldn't believe humans were capable of this level of social engineering. The Romans figured out how to make people desperately crave acceptance from groups that were designed to reject them, and they made rejection feel like a personal failing rather than systemic exclusion. Here's the setup that's going to mess with your head. Romans created these exclusive social clubs, religious cults, and professional associations that appeared to be based on merit or virtue, but were actually designed with impossible standards that kept most people in a permanent state of almost good enough. Let me paint you a picture of how diabolical this was. You'd have these mystery religions, like the cult of Mithras, that promised spiritual enlightenment and brotherhood, but the initiation process was deliberately brutal and arbitrary. Most people would fail, not because they weren't worthy, but because the system was designed to maintain artificial scarcity of membership. But here's the genius part. When people got rejected, they didn't blame the system. They blamed themselves. They'd think, I'm not strong enough, I'm not pure enough, I need to try harder. The rejection made membership seem more valuable, not less. And the people who did get in, they became the most loyal defenders of the system that had tortured them, because admitting the process was rigged would mean admitting their special status was meaningless. Does this sound like anything in your life right now? Maybe something involving exclusive social clubs, fraternity hazing, competitive academic programs, or job interview processes designed to be needlessly difficult and arbitrary? The Romans weaponized a basic human psychological vulnerability. We value things more when they're hard to get, and we assume that exclusivity equals quality. So they created systems where inclusion was artificially scarce, making people compete for acceptance rather than questioning why acceptance was limited in the first place. But here's where things get really wild. They didn't just use this for clubs and cults. They used it for entire social classes. Roman citizenship itself was structured this way. There were citizens, then there were better citizens, then there were elite citizens. Each level with slightly different privileges, and each transition requiring you to prove your worthiness to people who had arbitrary power over your advancement. Fast forward to 2025, and we've turned this into a science. Dating apps use artificial scarcity. They show you limited matches to make each one feel more valuable. Social media platforms use it. Blue check marks, exclusive features, limited beta access. Universities use it. Artificially low acceptance rates that have nothing to do with educational quality and everything to do with manufactured prestige. The gig economy runs on this principle. Uber and Lyft create driver tiers with special privileges that you have to maintain through metrics that change without warning. Amazon creates seller levels that promise better visibility but require jumping through increasingly arbitrary hoops. Even modern social movements use this technique. There are the casual supporters, the real activists, the serious organizers, and the inner circle of people who've proven their dedication through increasingly demanding tests of loyalty. Plot twist incoming. The most insidious part isn't that these systems exist. It's that they make you grateful for crumbs while calling it a feast. Think about exclusive credit cards that charge you annual fees for the privilege of spending your own money with them. Think about loyalty programs that require you to spend thousands of dollars to unlock basic customer service. Think about social groups where you have to constantly prove you're cool enough to remain included. The Romans figured out that if you make people work for acceptance, they'll value that acceptance more than if you just gave it to them freely. And they'll defend the system that makes them work for it, because admitting the system is rigged would mean admitting they worked hard for something worthless. But here's where our story takes its darkest turn, because the sixth Roman trick shows how they used people's fear of social rejection to make them participate in the persecution of others. They figured out how to turn victims into perpetrators by making persecution feel like group bonding, and it's the psychological mechanism behind every form of bullying, mob mentality, and social ostracism that still exists today. Real talk. This next part is going to sound absolutely bonkers, but stick with me. The Romans didn't just want to control individuals. They wanted to turn social groups into self-policing enforcement mechanisms. They figured out how to make belonging contingent on your willingness to reject outsiders, and they made rejection feel like protection rather than cruelty. Hold up. Before we dive deeper, let me know in the comments if you've ever found yourself trying extra hard to fit into a group that seemed designed to keep you on the outside, or if you think you'd recognize this manipulation when it's happening to you. Because what I'm about to show you is how the Romans made ordinary people into willing enforcers of systems that would eventually be used against them too. All right, everyone. What I'm about to tell you is so psychologically twisted that it's going to make you question every group dynamic you've ever been part of. The Romans figured out how to take people who were being oppressed and turn them into enthusiastic oppressors of people just one level below them. And they did it by making persecution feel like protection, exclusion feel like standards, and cruelty feel like justice. This is the darkest Roman trick we've covered so far, and it's everywhere in modern life. Here's how it worked. And I want you to pay attention, because this pattern is probably playing out in your life right now. The Romans created hierarchical systems where each level had just enough privilege to look down on the level below them, but not enough power to challenge the levels above them. Picture this. You're a freed slave in Rome. You've been through hell. You know what real oppression looks like. But now you have just a tiny bit of status. You're not a current slave. Guess what the Romans convinced you to do with that microscopic privilege? Use it to keep current slaves in line. You become the enforcer of the system that destroyed you because you're terrified of falling back down to where you came from. But here's the genius part that would make every modern HR department take notes. They made this feel like virtue. You weren't oppressing slaves, you were maintaining order. You weren't being cruel, you were being realistic about their situation. You weren't perpetuating the system that hurt you, you were helping them understand how the world works. The psychological manipulation here is so perfect it's almost artistic. They took people's trauma and weaponized it against others. They took people's fear and turned it into aggression. They took people's desire to never be powerless again and channeled it into making sure others stayed powerless. And the most insidious part? They made people compete for the right to oppress others. Being allowed to punch down became a privilege that you had to earn and maintain. Real talk. This next part is going to sound absolutely bonkers. But stick with me. This isn't ancient history. This is the foundation of every toxic workplace, every abusive institution, and every social system that turns people against each other instead of against the system itself. Think about workplace hierarchies where middle managers, who have no real power and are treated terribly by upper management, take out their frustration on entry-level employees. They're not evil people. They're traumatized people who've been convinced that their tiny bit of authority is precious and needs to be defended. Think about academic institutions where graduate students who are being exploited by professors turn around and haze undergraduates. They're not sadists. They're people who've been conditioned to believe that paying your dues is a natural law rather than an arbitrary system of hazing. Think about social media dynamics where people who've been marginalized in some ways use whatever small platform they have to attack people who are marginalized in different ways. Everyone's fighting for scraps while the people at the top extract value from the conflict. Plot twist incoming. The Romans didn't just create these hierarchies randomly, they engineered them specifically to prevent solidarity. They made sure that everyone had someone to look down on, so no one would look up and question who was really in charge. Poor Romans looked down on slaves. Slaves looked down on gladiators. Gladiators looked down on criminals. Everyone had someone they were allowed to feel superior to, which made them defend a system that was oppressing all of them. But here's where things get really wild. The Romans took this system and weaponized shame as the enforcement mechanism. They convinced people that falling down the hierarchy was a moral failing, not a systemic problem. If you lost your status, it wasn't because the system was rigged against you. It was because you weren't strong enough, smart enough, or virtuous enough. And the people who had been where you were, they'd be the first to tell you that you deserved it. Because admitting the system was arbitrary would mean admitting their current position was arbitrary too. This is why you see people who've escaped poverty become the harshest critics of people still in poverty. This is why you see people who've overcome addiction become the most judgmental about people struggling with addiction. This is why you see people who've climbed corporate ladders become the most ruthless about maintaining those hierarchies. The system doesn't just create victims, it creates grateful victims who become voluntary enforcers. And this is where our story takes a hard left turn into something that's going to make you paranoid about every piece of advice you've ever received. Because the seventh Roman trick shows how they convinced people to give up their own interests by disguising exploitation as wisdom. They figured out how to make terrible advice sound like ancient wisdom, and how to make people feel grateful for guidance that was designed to keep them in their place. If you're still with me, you're about to witness the most insidious form of psychological manipulation. How the Romans turned mentorship into a weapon and made people thank their oppressors for the chains. Listen up, because what I'm about to tell you is going to make you question every piece of life advice you've ever received from someone in a position of power over you. The Romans figured out how to disguise exploitation as mentorship, oppression as guidance, and manipulation as wisdom. And they made people feel grateful for advice that was specifically designed to keep them powerless. This is the trick that's going to mess with your head the most, because it targets the one relationship we're supposed to be able to trust. The relationship between teacher and student, mentor and mentee, elder and younger. Here's how diabolically clever this was. Romans created a culture where experienced people would take younger people under their wing, not to help them succeed, but to teach them how to accept their place in the hierarchy while feeling like they were being guided toward success. Picture this. You're a young Roman with ambition, and an older, successful Roman offers to mentor you. Sounds great, right? Here's what that mentorship actually looked like. They'd teach you to work twice as hard for half the reward, and they'd make it sound like wisdom. They'd teach you to accept disrespect with grace, and they'd call it building character. They'd teach you to compete with your peers instead of questioning the system, and they'd call it understanding human nature. But here's the kicker that would make every toxic boss in modern history jealous. They'd frame all of this as doing you a favor. They weren't exploiting you. They were toughening you up for the real world. They weren't keeping you down. They were teaching you patience and humility. They weren't manipulating you. They were sharing hard-earned wisdom. And the most insidious part? They'd use their own success as proof that their advice worked, conveniently leaving out the part where their success came from exploiting people who followed that advice. Real talk. This next part is going to sound absolutely bonkers, but stick with me. This isn't ancient history. This is every toxic workplace culture, every exploitative mentorship, and every piece of life advice designed to make you accept less than you deserve. Think about hustle culture mentors who tell you that working 80-hour weeks is paying your dues, while they make money from courses teaching you to work yourself to death. Think about business gurus who tell you that asking for fair compensation shows limited thinking, while they extract value from your underpaid labor. Think about career advisors who tell you to be grateful for any opportunity, while the opportunities they're describing would never be acceptable for them. The Roman version of this was called clientela, the patron-client relationship. Successful Romans would take on clients, younger people who would do their bidding in exchange for protection and guidance. But the guidance was always the same. Accept your subordinate position, work harder for less, and be grateful for the privilege. Plot twist incoming. The most effective version of this manipulation is when the mentor genuinely believes their own advice, because it makes the manipulation feel authentic. Think about it. A Roman senator who started as a client himself would genuinely believe that accepting exploitation builds character, because that's how he rationalized his own exploitation. He's not consciously trying to manipulate you. He genuinely thinks he's helping you by teaching you to accept the same system that damaged him. This is why you see successful people giving advice that would be terrible if followed literally. They're not lying. They're sharing the story they had to tell themselves to survive their own exploitation, not the actual strategies that led to their success. But here's where things get really wild. The Romans weaponized gratitude as the enforcement mechanism for this system. The worse the advice, the more grateful you were supposed to be for receiving it. If your mentor told you to work for free to gain experience, questioning that advice wasn't critical thinking, it was ingratitude. If your patron gave you tasks that benefited him more than you, complaining wasn't standing up for yourself, It was being ungrateful for his investment in you. The system created a psychological trap where the people being exploited became the most vocal defenders of the people exploiting them, because admitting the mentorship was harmful would mean admitting they'd wasted years of their life following terrible advice. And this is where our story takes a hard left turn into something that's going to make you paranoid about every motivational message you've ever heard. Because the 8th Roman trick shows how they convinced entire populations to work against their own interests by reframing suffering as virtue and struggle as character development. They figured out how to make people proud of their own exploitation, and it's the psychological foundation behind every inspirational message that tells you to be grateful for circumstances that are objectively terrible. But here's where things get really wild. Before we dive into how the Romans convinced people to love their own oppression, drop a comment and let me know. Have you ever received advice that sounded wise but left you worse off than before? Or have you ever found yourself giving advice to others that you realize was just you repeating what someone told you, without questioning whether it was actually good advice? Because what I'm about to show you is how the Romans turned suffering into a virtue and made people compete to see who could endure the most while calling it personal growth. Buckle up, Buttercup, because this Roman trick is so psychologically devastating that when modern therapists first studied it, they had to create new categories of trauma to describe what it does to people. The Romans figured out how to make suffering feel like achievement, endurance feel like strength, and exploitation feel like character development. And they made people compete to see who could tolerate the most abuse while calling it personal growth. This is the trick that's going to make you question every inspirational message you've ever seen about grinding through adversity and what doesn't kill you makes you stronger. Here's how it worked, and I want you to pay attention because this is your life. The Romans created a cultural mythology around suffering that reframed every form of exploitation as a character-building opportunity. Not getting paid fairly? That's teaching you the value of money. Being overworked? That's building your work ethic. Being disrespected? That's developing your patience and humility. But here's the genius part that would make every toxic productivity guru weep with joy. They made people compete to see who could suffer the most gracefully. Complaining about terrible conditions wasn't seen as having standards. It was seen as being weak. Asking for better treatment wasn't seen as having self-respect. It was seen as being soft. The Romans called this virtues, but not the civic virtue we talked about earlier. This was personal virtue through endurance. The more you could take without breaking, the more virtuous you were. The more unfair treatment you could accept with grace, the stronger your character was. Picture this. You're a Roman soldier on a brutal campaign, barely getting fed, marching through hostile territory, watching your friends die. The message you're getting isn't, "This is terrible and shouldn't happen." The message is, "This is making you into a real man." The message is, "This is what separates the strong from the weak." The message is, "This suffering is the price of greatness." And the most diabolical part? When you finally break down from the abuse, that's not seen as a natural human response to inhuman conditions. That's seen as a personal failing. You didn't have enough character. You weren't strong enough. You weren't virtuous enough to handle what strong people can handle. Real talk. Does any of this sound familiar? Maybe something involving hustle culture that tells you sleep is for the weak, or workplace cultures that treat burnout as a character flaw, or social movements that measure your commitment by how much you're willing to sacrifice your mental health. The Romans weaponized one of humanity's most beautiful qualities, our ability to find meaning in suffering, and turned it into a tool for extracting compliance. They took the natural human tendency to rationalize difficult experiences and scaled it up into a system of mass psychological manipulation. But here's where things get really wild. They didn't just apply this to individuals. They applied it to entire social classes. Poor people weren't poor because of systemic inequality. They were poor because they hadn't developed the character that comes from struggling with poverty. Slaves weren't oppressed because slavery was evil. They were in a character-building situation that would make them stronger people. Fast forward to 2025, and we've turned this into a science that would make Roman philosophers jealous. Self-help culture tells you that if you're not constantly pushing yourself to your breaking point, you're not growing. Fitness culture tells you that if it doesn't hurt, it's not working. Career culture tells you that if you're comfortable, you're stagnating. The gig economy runs on this principle. They don't call it exploitation, they call it entrepreneurship. You're not being denied benefits and job security, you're building resilience and learning to adapt. You're not being underpaid, you're paying your dues and investing in your future. Even wellness culture has weaponized this concept. You're not being asked to accept terrible life circumstances, you're being asked to practice gratitude and find the lesson. You're not being gaslit about your legitimate complaints, you're being invited to reframe your mindset and choose your perspective. Plot twist incoming. The most insidious part isn't that these messages exist, it's that they contain just enough truth to be believable. Humans do grow through challenges. Resilience is a real and valuable quality. Some difficult experiences do lead to positive outcomes. But the Romans figured out how to exploit this truth and use it to justify unnecessary suffering. They took the genuine human capacity for post-traumatic growth and weaponized it to excuse pre-traumatic exploitation. Think about it. Just because some people can find meaning in difficult experiences doesn't mean we should create more difficult experiences. Just because some people develop strength through adversity doesn't mean we should subject everyone to unnecessary adversity. But here's where our story takes its penultimate dark turn. Because the ninth Roman trick shows how they took all of these psychological manipulation techniques and packaged them into a single, comprehensive system that made people believe their exploitation was freedom. Their manipulation was education, and their oppression was opportunity. They created the ultimate psychological trap, a system that made victims grateful to be victims while believing they were actually victors. And this is where things get really twisted, because the next Roman trick I'm going to show you is how they convinced people that recognizing these manipulation techniques made you paranoid, ungrateful, and weak. They made critical thinking feel like cynicism, and they made awareness feel like negativity. Before we dive deeper, let me know in the comments, after hearing about all these Roman tricks, are you starting to see them everywhere in modern life? Or do you think I'm being too paranoid and these are just natural human social dynamics? Because what I'm about to show you is how the Romans made questioning the system feel like a moral failing, and how that same technique is being used right now to make you doubt your own perceptions of manipulation. All right, folks, we've reached the penultimate Roman trick, and this one is so meta that it's going to make your brain hurt. The Romans figured out how to weaponize people's natural desire to be reasonable, balanced, and well-adjusted, and they used it to make critical thinking feel like paranoia, awareness feel like negativity, and pattern recognition feel like mental illness. This is the trick that protects all the other tricks. Here's how it worked, and I want you to pay attention, because this is happening to you right now as you're listening to this. The Romans created a social stigma around people who pointed out systematic manipulation. They made questioning authority feel antisocial, recognizing patterns feel obsessive, and talking about exploitation feel like complaining. Picture this. You're a Roman citizen, and you start noticing that all these separate social systems we've been talking about are actually connected. You realize that bread and circuses, the status ladder, civic virtue, artificial scarcity, they're all working together to keep people distracted, divided, and compliant. You try to talk to people about it. Here's what happens. People don't engage with your observations. Instead, they question your mental state. You're being too negative. You're seeing conspiracies everywhere. Why can't you just enjoy life instead of looking for problems? You're becoming paranoid. Maybe you should focus on your own life instead of criticizing everything. But here's the genius part that would make every modern gaslighter take notes. They made these responses feel like wisdom, balance, and mental health. Ignoring systematic manipulation wasn't denial. It was choosing positivity. Refusing to see patterns wasn't ignorance. It was not overthinking things. Accepting exploitation wasn't submission. It was being grateful for what you have. The Romans figured out that humans have a deep psychological need to feel normal, reasonable, and well-adjusted. So they made awareness feel abnormal, critical thinking feel unreasonable, and pattern recognition feel maladjusted. And the most diabolical part? They made people police this themselves. You didn't need thought police when people would self-censor rather than risk seeming negative or paranoid. Real talk. This is happening to you right now as you're listening to this video. Part of your brain is probably thinking, this guy is reading too much into things. These are just normal social dynamics. He's being too cynical. Maybe I shouldn't take this too seriously because people might think I'm becoming one of those conspiracy theory people. That voice in your head questioning whether you should trust your own pattern recognition? That's the Roman paranoia trap, and it's been refined over 2,000 years to be absolutely perfect. Modern systems have weaponized mental health language to make awareness feel like illness. You're catastrophizing. You're being hypervigilant. You need to work on your trust issues. This sounds like anxiety talking. Maybe you should focus on self-care instead of worrying about systems you can't control. The therapeutic language makes it sound caring and helpful, but the function is identical to what the Romans did. It makes people doubt their own perceptions when those perceptions threaten existing power structures. Plot twist incoming. The most effective version of this manipulation is when it's delivered by people who genuinely care about your well-being. When your friends, family, or therapist tells you to focus on what you can control instead of analyzing systematic problems, they're not trying to manipulate you. They're trying to protect your mental health, but the net effect is the same as deliberate manipulation. But here's where things get really twisted. The Romans took this system and weaponized shame as the enforcement mechanism. They made people feel ashamed of their own intelligence, ashamed of their pattern recognition, ashamed of their refusal to accept obvious manipulation. Think about how this plays out in modern life. If you point out that social media is designed to be addictive, people tell you to just use it responsibly. If you notice that gig economy companies are structured to exploit workers, people tell you to appreciate the flexibility. If you recognize that hustle culture is psychologically harmful, people tell you you're making excuses or have a scarcity mindset. The system makes you feel like there's something wrong with you for noticing that there's something wrong with the system. And this is where our story reaches its climax, because the final Roman trick shows how they took all of these techniques and created a master system that made people believe their awareness of manipulation was itself a form of manipulation. They convinced people that the real problem wasn't the systems that exploited them. It was their own negative attitude about being exploited. If you're still with me, you're about to witness the most insane plot twist in this entire story. How the Romans created a psychological prison so perfect that the prisoners became grateful guards who would attack anyone trying to point out that they were in prison at all. Pause the video right now and guess what happens next. How do you think the Romans convinced people that recognizing psychological manipulation was actually a form of psychological manipulation? Because what I'm about to show you is the ultimate mind-bender that explains why these 2,000-year-old tricks still work perfectly today. Hold up. Before we get to the final reveal, smash that like button if this is blowing your mind, and let me know in the comments. Do you think learning about these manipulation techniques makes you more free, or do you think it just makes you more paranoid and unhappy? Because your answer to that question will tell you whether the final Roman trick is currently working on you. All right, everyone. We've reached the final Roman trick, and this one is so psychologically sophisticated that it's going to make everything else we've talked about seem like child's play. The Romans figured out how to make people believe that recognizing manipulation was actually a form of manipulation, that awareness was actually ignorance, and that freedom was actually a prison. They created the ultimate psychological paradox that protects all the other tricks by making people afraid of their own intelligence. This is the trick that explains why these 2,000-year-old techniques still work perfectly in 2025. Here's the setup that's going to blow your mind. The Romans didn't just want people to accept manipulation, they wanted people to prefer it. They wanted to create a situation where people would choose to stay manipulated even when someone showed them exactly how the manipulation worked. Picture this. You're a Roman citizen, and someone explains to you exactly what we've been talking about for the last hour. They show you how bread and circuses work, how the status ladder functions, how civic virtue gets weaponized, how suffering gets reframed as character building. You understand it all perfectly. You see the patterns everywhere. And then something interesting happens. You realize that seeing these patterns makes you feel worse, not better. Before you understood the manipulation, you could enjoy the gladiator fights without thinking about how they were designed to redirect your anger. You could feel proud of your small promotions without realizing they were designed to keep you distracted. You could find meaning in your suffering without recognizing that most of it was artificially created and unnecessary. But now that you see how it all works, you can't unsee it. The magic is gone. The meaning feels hollow. The simple pleasures don't work anymore. You feel like you're living in a world full of puppets, and you're the only one who can see the strings. Here's the genius part that would make every modern psychological manipulator weep with envy. The Romans made this awareness feel like the real problem. They convinced people that ignorance was bliss, that overthinking was the enemy of happiness, and that people who saw through the manipulation were actually the most manipulated of all. Real talk. This next part is going to sound absolutely bonkers, but stick with me. The Romans created a narrative that went like this. Sure, these systems exist, but focusing on them makes you miserable. The truly wise person chooses to focus on what they can control and finds happiness within whatever system they find themselves in. The people who constantly analyze and criticize are actually trapped by their own negativity, while the people who just accept things as they are have found true freedom. Does this sound familiar? Maybe something involving you can't control the system, you can only control your response to it? Or focusing on problems you can't solve is just making yourself unhappy? Or the real prison is in your mind. You can be free anywhere if you choose the right attitude. But here's where things get really twisted. This narrative contains just enough truth to be psychologically devastating. It's true that awareness can be uncomfortable. It's true that ignorance can feel blissful. It's true that you can't control everything. It's true that attitude matters. But the Romans weaponized these partial truths to make people choose comfortable manipulation over uncomfortable freedom. Plot twist incoming. The most insidious part isn't that this narrative exists. It's that it makes people feel superior for choosing to remain manipulated. You're not naive for ignoring systematic exploitation. You're spiritually evolved. You're not in denial about manipulation. You're choosing peace. You're not avoiding difficult truths. You're practicing acceptance. The system makes people feel enlightened for choosing ignorance, wise for avoiding wisdom, and free for accepting slavery. And here's the final twist that explains everything. The Romans realized that the people most likely to see through manipulation were also the people most likely to value truth, justice, and human dignity. So they made those values feel like burdens. They convinced people that caring about truth made you obsessive, that caring about justice made you bitter, and that caring about human dignity made you judgmental. They made compassion feel like weakness, awareness feel like paranoia, and critical thinking feel like cynicism. The ultimate Roman trick wasn't just manipulating people. It was making people grateful to be manipulated and suspicious of anyone trying to free them. Think about how this plays out in your life right now. When you point out systematic problems, people don't usually argue with your facts. Instead, they question why you're focusing on negative things. They don't defend the systems that exploit them. They defend their right to ignore those systems. I know the world has problems, but I choose to focus on the positive. I know these companies are manipulating us, but getting upset about it won't change anything. I know the system isn't fair, but I'd rather find happiness within it than make myself miserable fighting it. Every single one of these responses is a modern version of the final Roman trick, making people feel wise for choosing comfortable ignorance over uncomfortable truth. But here's where our story reaches its real conclusion. Because now that you know all 10 Roman tricks, you have a choice to make. You can't unknow what you know. You can't unsee the patterns. You can't go back to unconscious participation in systems designed to manipulate you. You can choose to use this awareness to make better decisions, to resist manipulation when you see it, to create systems that serve human flourishing instead of exploitation. Or you can choose to believe that awareness itself is the problem, that ignorance is bliss, and that the people trying to show you these patterns are actually trying to make you miserable. The Romans would tell you that the second choice is wisdom, that focusing on what you can't control is foolishness, that finding peace within systems of exploitation is enlightenment. But here's what the Romans didn't want you to know. Awareness isn't the prison. The prison is believing that awareness is the prison. Knowledge isn't the burden. The burden is believing that knowledge is the burden. Critical thinking isn't the trap. The trap is believing that critical thinking is the trap. What do you think? Was this whole video just making you paranoid and unhappy? Or did it give you tools to recognize and resist manipulation that's been affecting your life for years? Let me know in the comments, because your answer will tell us whether the Romans are still winning or whether 2,000 years later, we're finally ready to beat them at their own game. And if you made it this far, you've just experienced something the Romans never expected. A complete breakdown of their psychological control systems, delivered by someone who refuses to pretend that comfortable lies are better than uncomfortable truths. Smash that subscribe button if you want more deep dives into how ancient manipulation techniques are still running your modern life. And let me know what historical psychological warfare you want me to expose next. Because this is just the beginning of understanding how the past is controlling your present. The Romans thought they had created the perfect system of psychological control. Turns out, they just created the perfect case study for recognizing psychological control. And once you can see it, you can't be controlled by it. Welcome to the other side of 2,000 years of manipulation. The view is uncomfortable, but at least it's real.